Sí, ya son las 11:15. Vamos a empezar la segunda parte del taller de la mañana. Ya. Sí, sí, podemos tomar asiento que vamos a empezar la segunda parte de la mañana.
Van a ser tres. Van a ser tres.
Sí, pues ahora vamos a empezar entonces la segunda parte de la mañana. Tenemos con nosotros de nuevo a Tom y vamos a hablar de los elementos esenciales del plan integrado de planificación de distribución eléctrica.
Thank you, Jorge. So this segment of our discussion is going to talk more of a deep dive into a couple of components of integrated distribution planning. And so what's important here is that while it's a partial deep dive, these may be areas for follow-ups in future workshops. So I'm not going to get to that level of detail. Happy to deal with Q&A that gets into detail. So I'm going back to the slide that we used that Joe and Samir talked to about the change between traditional distribution planning and integrated distribution planning. And so I'm going to talk to four components in more detail. One is load and DR forecasts at the T&D level, different than the IRP conversation. I'm going to talk about hosting capacity. And, you know, that's a relatively new term for folks. And by relatively, I mean years. But understanding what that is and what our needs is part of a conversation. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about non-wires alternatives or sourcing. And I'm going to bring in interconnection. And important for interconnection, I know there's a proceeding, so I am not looking to go into a lot of detail on interconnection, but to talk a little bit about interconnection in lieu of planning. And so that we don't, it's an important part of the planning process. We don't want to ignore it, and we want to talk to that perspective. So load and DR forecasting as an area, and a lot of these tie to technologies, customer strategy, and stakeholder engagement. So all of the areas that have jurisdictions that have been trying to drive integrated distribution planning, these are the four general areas that are the evolution that get argued about the most. Because they're the real-time struggles with understanding valuation for DER, how to consider it, rudimentary approaches as NEM, or evolving approaches as an example. So that's why we picked these. So I'm going to start with load and DR forecasting, and simplistic start to that. First, I'm going to say that if I looked at the IRP, and so when you look at the IRP, the details being asked about load and DR forecasting, when you think about it at a system level, all align with a lot of the discussion here. But what's important for the conversation is when you think about other jurisdictions, the majority of the other areas have not done that level of detail yet. It is done at the system level, and so I'm going to be talking about what this means for change and evolution at distribution level and what the struggles have been for other companies as they go through it, as you think about the planning process. So in load and DR forecasting, there are two components of interest. One is you generally have an annual sales forecast that is on a kilowatt hour, gigawatt hour, terawatt hour basis, and that is the energy throughput. And then the more critical one for your capital planning is your annual peak demand. So the work you do to understand what that means. The majority of companies have dealt with that at the system level. And so they understand it at the high level system level, but they don't truly understand the details of it as you go through the system, through the transmission system, at a substation level, and how it gets disaggregated. In many areas, they just do a disaggregation. They say X amount of substations, they have these kind of capacities, and they take a percentage of that, and they use it because they don't have a lot of detailed data. That's not acceptable going forward, obviously. And then what do you think about it at the feeder level? So these are things that are different for load and DR forecasting. So today, it's been, and Jorge talked to it earlier, about econometric forecasts, understanding gross national product, utilizing those kind of modeling at the system level to utilize historical norms going forward, and then to modify that forecast going forward. As we think about it here, we have to take much more into consideration when you take involving load change associated with DR components. So in this case, we're talking about what are the impacts that DR provide, not just at the system level, but at all the components below that. So the uncertainty, there's a lot of material here, good to take away. We are providing the slides. But the critical components here is, number one, weather uncertainty is a major component in load and DR forecasting. First of all, it is you may not experience your design weather condition this year. So you must have a correction factor for whatever your design condition is for weather. So if you have a 86-degree variable that may have a humidity component to it, you have to modify that component, and that gets used. That's been done historically. But what's also important as you think about DERs, PV, energy storage, these are all other components that are variable associated with weather, wind and PV predominantly. What is happening at the time in which you're designing your system, and what are your rules by which you're going to accept a modified forecast associated with those new DER? And energy storage is also similar. It's not weather-wise, but it's regarding the use case. Who owns it? How are they operating it? And what are their priorities for its level of operation? If the utility owns it, they pretty much know what they're going to pull the trigger on to use it. When they don't, they have to have contracts, and there's uncertainty associated with that. There are elements of data availability. I think there was quite a bit of conversation this morning about the available data. At a system level, the level of data is pretty much well known. But once you get down through the system and you're trying to measure on a second-by-second or minute-by-minute basis so that you can trend data, the amount of data available as you go through the system erodes. And I'm being generic. The conversation that I heard this morning from some of the engineering team is very consistent with my knowledge of what I've seen in many areas. There are locations throughout the U.S. where very many 4 kV substations aren't even monitored. So they have to have a sense for the disaggregation of load at a higher level and place it within their models at those substations. So it's variable. There's an uncertainty component to it. You are going to have a level of conservatism and how you approach utilizing it because you don't have the data to work with, or you need it to work with. Market and policy changes, Joe talked a lot about that. What are the impacts that are regulatory engines that are impacting how you want to look at DER? And that creates uncertainty. And I can give you an example of that. In New York, the commission was trying to push DER development. Very clear goal, very good objective from an environmental perspective. They instituted community DG in an order in October 2015. The implications of that was a very high revenue stream for third-party developers who now had NEM at a much higher level than it would have had at a smaller level. And therefore, hundreds of applications hit the utilities for 1 megawatt and 2 megawatt type systems in New York over a 2 to 3 month period. So the utilities all of a sudden had this queue management problem, and it was driven by a change. Was it an intended consequence? No, clearly not. Did the commission recognize that pulling the trigger at that time in that way, without controlling it to some degree, would have had that? No, they didn't. So coming out from under that, how much of the queue was real became a very big question. The utilities were happy to work on real projects, but they struggled with the fact that they didn't understand first in queue usually is first out. But in this case, how real were the projects? As it turns out, 50% of those projects never came to fruition. And there was a whole process change to try to figure out how many of them were real or not. That's an example of there are changes in policies that impact this that you need to be aware of. Technology enhancements are a key component. I think we talked a little bit this morning about that, and Joe's going to talk about grid mod too. And then customer preferences. Customers want to get engaged. In some cases, it's developers on behalf of customers, not the customers themselves. They want to see the change in the bill, quite frankly. So the developers are acting as a prosumer in that case. Here's an example of a PGE slide that talks a little bit about trying to understand DER and quantifying uncertainty in the change in forecasting process. So here's a company that is experiencing and was experiencing very significant change in DER integration within their system. And they needed to build out and understand their forecasting process. So they looked at 5 components. First of all, what are all my technology components? And how do I want to think about that technology and their uncertainty? And for each one, what data do I have? What can I access with data? PV is an example. They had quite a bit of data for output of PV systems in California. So they understood over time what those systems could provide and would provide, and there was variability with that. They had to look at the quality of the data. In some cases with EVs, it was theoretical because they didn't have as much as to where it would be expected. And performance of individual technologies. They had to look at a framework. And so when you think about framework, I think Joe alluded to the fact that some of the framework, when you think about DER adoption, it can be considered a deterministic view. I pick a line of sight, and I say, based upon history, that's my line of sight, and that's my projection. That won't work with DER, very clearly. The changes in DER are so quick that you're not going to be able to use a linear approach. Scenario approaches are very common. California has a built-in process to look at scenario development. So they have a base case, a low and a high. They look at that from a system level, and they try to disaggregate it down. So in this case, that framework was what they were using in California. You have to decide on a framework that makes sense as you're thinking about it. You have to develop a set of assumptions, and this is where the rubber meets the road. These are the assumptions that are going to drive how you're going to spend money based upon a resulting forecast. So these are negotiated assumptions that at the end of the day are where you make the biggest changes. So what level of subsidies are being driven through policy? What programs are being prescribed? What will the utility provide as a program? What will the state provide as a program? What are the prices and how do I price them? Is there going to be a tariff that's going to set the price so you have a known price revenue stream? Or is there going to be a market component to it? Is there going to be an unknown so I can't bank and think about how do I fund some of these? That's been part of the concerns on energy storage and whether you consider PPAs or just use a tariff for some valuations. And then developing your range of outputs. So for each one of the technologies, what PGE had in their quantifying uncertainty was for each technology to have a view on this approach so they can look at the DER components in their forecasts. And then you take a couple of staged approach for using it. One is what do I have with data about the counting of it? How much granularity do I have in my forecast? And I'm going to go through these in more detail. And then going beyond just a deterministic method, one solution that gets a result that I plan off of. Or do I understand that there's a set of outcomes that might be somewhat different than one approach? So this waterfall chart here talks a little bit about how do you think in an evolution of traditional load forecasting. On the left side of the chart, it talks about real actual load demand. That's the purple. And then on top of that, you add your weather adjustments. So I talked a little bit about that. That's your starting point. And we have a lot more knowledge, but not as much knowledge at the substation and circuit level. So folks do know it at the system level, but don't really have it when you get down at that other level. So they have to have some mechanism for determining it. And then from that, you start with, what's my understood new business growth? So for most utilities, you have a queue of your new business area. You look at the queue, and you map it to your substations and your areas to understand where am I going to see new business growth. And then you increase that expected load for when you think that growth is going to come on. Probably a 3 to 5 year window of that, not beyond, because you're not getting applications for a building construction 10 years out, usually within that couple of year time period. And then you have additional growth as your expected EVs are a good example here. Add the EVs. Where do I think they're going to occur? You might have a system-wide number for a growth potential, but how do you think about where those EVs will be accommodated in Puerto Rico? Where do you think folks will buy them? And so you'll have to think that some of your substations are going to have a higher percentage of pickup with EVs versus other areas. And those are the assumptions that you're going to have to build in. Then you look and say, what are my adoption and agreements for demand response programs or energy efficiency? Do you have historical norms? What is the funding for those programs that's guaranteed, that's already in budgets that folks are going to spend? You can understand the output of that by having that experience or leveraging that of others. But added to that is, what is the nascent behavior for energy efficiency? Customers change equipment. They change out refrigerators, they change out air conditioning systems, and when you buy new ones, they're more efficient than they were prior. So that is already impacting. And what you see in load forecasting, quite frankly, is that we're getting a flattening of the curve, not just because of DER, because of a lot of energy efficiency, and that's being seen across the U.S. And then the result of that is a modified load forecast that represents a demand, whether you're at the system level, substation level, or circuit level. So the substation and circuit are still very much a work in progress in many utilities. The system level, this is happening much more aggressively at utilities to try to understand it so that the capital programs that result from these forecasts are solid and pass muster with regards to the type of validation and verification people are trying to achieve. So when you think about characteristics, the quality of data that you have working in these, this is where it gets very difficult. In some cases, folks have models. So if you have models for your substations and circuits, trying to align customers to substations and understand change is more feasible. If you don't have that connections or the quality of data isn't that good, the quality of your results isn't going to be that good. So that's a work in progress for most. AMI has been an area where in the jurisdictions where the regulatory agencies have been pushing DER and trying to meet targets that are aggressive, that they know and understand the need to understand the action of the customer at the premise. So the AMI metering system, automated metering infrastructure, not just the meter, the communication systems that has to get that back, and they may be 3 levels of communication systems to get the backhaul. The meter data management system that tracks it, validates it, corrects it, and feeds it into the rest of the systems. All of that is tied into what we would call AMI. But when folks have spent the money on AMI, they're expecting their results to get to the level of detailed data characteristics that can feed into the processes. So when you're doing load forecasting at a circuit level, and there are 1,200 customers on that circuit, and you have meters for those customers, you can have analytics going on in the background to understand what the use is on that circuit all year long. And then you can work from that for a load forecasting. Question.
Pregunta sobre este asunto de AMI. Parece importante y he visto el uso de AMI en otras jurisdicciones. Aquí,
I-
¿cómo?
I'm
I'm sorry,
English?
okay.
It's okay if you can. Thank you very much.
Here in
I don't have my headset on.
here for the AMI technology here in Puerto Rico, we've seen some experiment with that because there was an executive order right after the hurricane that required that, and it caused a lot of confusion for some of the battery and inverter manufacturers because of the lack of standards here of which AMI to use. One thing I'd like to encourage is that we continue this discussion, but also consider the appropriate level of penetration to require that. Looking at one of the most antiquated grids in the nation, as far as the walk, jog, run. So my question is there a certain level of penetration that you have seen in your experience where this could be particularly useful? Like, should we be thinking about when we get to 5 or 10% level of penetration, having this sort of grid interaction modernization feature? Or really should we be talking about deploying it as quickly as possible?
Yeah. So the communications he's talking about, which is a very good point, were the communications that they were expecting at the inverter of the batteries to talk back to the grid. However, these comms didn't specify the protocol. Was it going to be some spec? What is going to be a 68, 1560 IEC? Now, what we're talking here also in regards to that, PJ, is in regards to the smart meters on the client. So I want to make sure that we are differentiating
Right.
between those two.